Lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you, Amrita, for your talk. I enjoyed that a lot, and Bernadette. Look, first of all, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here, and any Aboriginal people present in the audience. And I'd like to thank Nuria and Jorge for inviting me again. It's always good to talk to STARTS. You're the workers that work with these children. You talked before, Jorge, about it being a national shame, and I think that's right. It is something we will always be ashamed of as a nation, but I think I'm an optimist, and I think we should take positives out of this. We heard some positives from Amrita as well about being able to help the children, and we have a lot to be proud of as a nation as well around this, and I think I'll try and talk about that a little bit. I tend to talk about really depressing things, just as you do, and then I think it's important that we think of the positives that we've achieved. So the whole idea of offshore detention has been a disaster. 25 years and more. I'm sure Paul Keating did not intend this when he introduced mandatory detention in 1992, and it was Paul Keating that did it. And in February 2004, I'll give you some background. In February 2014, when Gillian Triggs, as president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, initiated her inquiry into children on Nauru, there were 1,138 children in detention. Okay? A year later, when she gave the speech after they actually completed the report in October or November of 2014, but the government held it back for a long time. And eventually it was released in about February or March 2015. And when she gave the speech, she said there were 119 children held indefinitely on Nauru. Okay, but there were some births on Nauru, and some children were in the community there, and by February 2018, so we're now doing the Februaries, if you see what I mean, since we're just past February 2019. February 2018, there were 158 children on Nauru. All of them had been there either for over 5 years, or if they were born there, for their whole life. Okay, now, I went to Nauru in December 2014 and was shocked by how awful the children were in terms of being so traumatized, and their parents in particular, and of course children are very much a reflection of what's happening to their parents. Their parents were the most despairing, hopeless people I'd ever met. And that was December 2014, and those children were still there until very recently. And so what happened then was, and I think, the Australian public, until recently, 60% of the Australian public, when asked, said that what the government was doing with people in detention was okay or not quite severe enough. So that's what we were fighting against, was the fact that we could not persuade the public to come with us. Now, I'm old enough that I was a student when the Vietnam War started. And I can remember being shocked at everyone being gung-ho about going off to Vietnam. We were going to teach those communists a lesson. And I was one of the few that was saying, this is not a good idea. This is a terrible idea. But I was only a kid. And we were marching in the streets in Grosvenor Square and goodness knows what. And eventually the whole world started to see the body bags, if you like, of people coming back from Vietnam. And the whole world shifted. The whole of the US shifted, and the war in Vietnam ended. Okay? Well, for us, the body bags, if you like, are the children. It was the children that people began to say, wait a minute, this isn't okay. And the Kids Off Nauru campaign was started in August, as you know, August 2018, saying we want to get all the kids off by November. And everyone bought into that. Not just World Vision, who started it, but almost all of the top charities, almost all of the top health organizations agreed that it was time to get the children off Nauru. And so by the end of the year, as we know, well, the last children have just left. Okay, and that's something we should be proud of. We've got the children off Nauru. And now, I was asked to talk. Now, I should say that in getting the children off Nauru, one of the ways that was achieved was through the lawyers. And the lawyers started to say, we're going to try and get these kids off Nauru, but they couldn't get them off without having health reports about how the children were doing. And IHMS weren't going to give them health reports about how the children were doing because they had too much of a conflict. And so they started engaging people like us. And when I say us, I'm talking about the paediatricians of the country, and in particular, my colleague at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, that many of you know, Alana Maycock, who's our clinical nurse consultant, became a sort of conduit. I have to tell you that we had the most traumatic year that we've ever had, and I've been running this clinic for 15 years, and Alana would get in touch with the people on Nauru, organize an interpreter, and then one of us would Skype them, or the equivalent of Skype on a mobile phone. Don't ask me, I'm an old man, but Alana would do it, and we'd talk to these families, and we'd ask them to show us the children. We'd take a history, it would take an hour, and you'd come out just shaking from these children. And the children that we were seeing at this stage had something that's called pervasive refusal syndrome. Now, pervasive refusal syndrome, sometimes it's called resignation syndrome. And I think you were sort of hinting at that a little bit, Amrita, as you talked about the horrible things that the children were going through after Omid's death. But these children just withdrew. They'd had enough. They stopped eating, they stopped drinking, they'd turn their face to the wall, they'd wet the bed, sometimes soil the bed as well. They wouldn't go to school, they wouldn't talk. If they did, people tried to talk to them, they'd be angry. Now this, we call it pervasive refusal syndrome, and that was the name first used when it was described 25 years ago, actually, just over 25 years ago. And it was described not in refugee children, but in apparently normal children, mostly girls. And the first description was of 4 girls seen at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. And these girls had just withdrawn. Nobody could quite work out why. The people who wrote the report wondered if they'd been sexually abused. Classically, the girls, it's now been described in the world literature, but very unusual. 2 cases a year reported in the whole world literature, so very unusual condition. The doctor who first described it has died, but his colleague, Ken Nunn, works with us as a child psychiatrist. Many of you probably know him. And so this condition, he then described in Australia and wrote reports about it and defined it in terms of really pretty well what I've said to you. One of the great advantages of using that sort of way of describing children is that anyone can describe it. So if you say, you take the history and you look at the child, now these children, I was afraid one of them was going to die. You'd have these children with their peripheries cold, to ask the parents, do their fingers feel warm or cold? And they say, you're not allowed to lead them. You say, don't say, do they feel cold? You say, what do they feel like, warm or cold? And they'd say, they feel cold. How far? Right up to the arm. So we'd say, I'm really worried. We'd try and get in touch with IHMS about it. Somebody might put a saline drip in for a bit and send them home again. Sometimes when they went to the clinics in Nauru, the parents were told, it's your fault that this child's not eating and drinking. You take them home and feed them, and if you don't, we're going to call the police. So we had these children in a terrible state. We had the lawyers trying to get them out. The government boasting that they've got the children off Nauru. The government paid $480,000 in the first 3 months of last year just blocking the children coming off Nauru, actually opposing the lawyers trying to get the kids off Nauru. So the government is one lot that can't be proud of what's happened here at all. So what happened? We got most of the children off. When they came, they would just arrive suddenly, pretty well. And hospitals would have to try and take these children in to see how sick they were. And Some of the children went to intensive care. At least 2 children I know of had to go to intensive care. Some of them started eating and drinking quite quickly. You can imagine that people will say, oh, they're malingering, they're all teaching each other to do this. We know of at least 40 children that fulfill this definition of pervasive refusal syndrome, okay, that have ended up coming to Australia. The condition was described previously in Sweden, and they had several hundred children, and people were saying that these were children coming out of Russia or the Soviet states, and the families were left in limbo in Sweden, not knowing what was going to happen to them, and the children just got desperate and also sort of lost hope. And again, there was this political thing: were they malingering or putting it on to try and get something to happen? And the pediatricians and the psychologists were saying, this is real, these kids are in real trouble. And others were saying, no, they're not, and people almost lost their jobs over this. Anyway, I'll tell you what happened when they come. I'm going to describe to you one case which I was given permission to, but I'm going to disguise it a bit. I'm going to call the girl Fatima, though that wasn't her name. And she arrived on a Friday afternoon, as so often, and we'd been running the heart clinic at the Children's Hospital all day, and they finally arrived. Oh, yes, I won't tell you that side of it, about how urgent it was that they came, but there was some suggestion, they could just stay for the weekend and be seen on the Monday. We said, no, this is a really sick child. And so she came with her mother. They'd been held up in Brisbane, told that they weren't going to be allowed to come into the country without a visa. Eventually got to the Children's Hospital, so they're flying from Nauru to Brisbane to Sydney. Okay, so this child's been going for 12 hours, has not eaten or drunken a thing the whole day. Just got her head down like this. I'm saying, would you like a sip of water? No. Does not want anything at all. She's been sent, originally they were going to send her just with her sister. Eventually they sent her with her mother, but leaving the sister and dad at home, on Nauru, and that they're here in Australia. Now, eventually we got the whole family here, and we said to the lawyers, from now on, you say the whole family has to come, not just splitting families. Because splitting families, clearly they're holding them hostage on Nauru, saying, oh, well, you're going to send them back. But that wasn't going to work at all. How could this child get better? And part of what Amrita was saying was that they were able to do a lot of good there on Nauru for the children, but they're re-traumatized because the situation traumatizes them. It's like child abuse. Until you remove them from that situation, you can't hope to get them better, really. So you don't leave the children with an abusive family because you can't work with them, as you know. So the child was on the ward with her mother in a single room, but they're still in detention. So there were guards there, 2 guards per person. Okay, so that's 4 guards in the middle of the adolescent ward, where most of the children have got eating disorders. It's great, They're not allowed to wear their guards' uniforms, okay, but they're pretty obviously guards standing around like that. So the first day, we'd stayed for several hours with this child, got them into the room, got them safe. Next day I went in, my wife had given me some toys and needlework and so on for the child. I went to give it to them, you're not allowed to. Mum said, I had $2,000, it's all been confiscated by the guards. Won't be given back to me, I'm not allowed to have that. I said, here, look, just have $20 and don't. I went outside, the guard said, did you give her money? You can't, you've got to take it back, not allowed to give her money. I said, but she's got nothing to get a packet of sweets or this or that. No, can't have, that's not allowed. I said, well, why? You're not allowed to show compassion? They say, those are the rules. You've got to do, everything's got to go through Australian Border Force. They're Serco, in fact, but, so we're not allowed to show any compassion whatsoever. I mean, you've seen this on Nauru, as you know. And then one time I went in there and there was a guard in the room. I said, what are you doing in the room? She said, it's my duty of care. I almost fell over. I said, guard, nurses, care. But I didn't. I wish I'd said that. I was just so angry, I just stomped out. But it's what I should have said to her. But I wrote it later on anyway. The guards were very rough with the adults. They would take them, grab them to take them to their own appointments, sometimes even threatened to handcuff them to go. We had a major run-ins over this, I can tell you. Alana, who takes no, I won't use the word from anyone. But anyway, duty of care. Do you know the term duty of care, where that comes from? It comes from a legal case in 1932 where a woman was drinking a bottle of ginger beer, and when she got to the bottom, there was a snail at the bottom of the bottle of ginger beer. And she sued, a Paisley woman from Scotland, and so she sued the company that made the ginger beer. And the judgment was that the company had a duty of care not to have snails at the bottom of their bottles, and so they had a duty of care to make sure that the ginger beer was okay. And that's where the term duty of care comes from. I was so angry about this guard using the term duty of care, I went and looked it up and said, where does this duty of care thing come from? I don't actually think we do have quite what a duty of care. We have moral obligations. I prefer to use that term because duty of care is so woolly, really. Okay, so this child spent 2 months in hospital. Some of the children spent much shorter time, and some of my colleagues don't really believe in this pervasive refusal syndrome. So we're studying these children. We're going to see how they do in follow-up and so on. And only time will tell. I know that at least a couple of people in the audience were telling me earlier on about working with one of these children who did have this pervasive refusal syndrome. So once, oh yes, by the way, I would tell you that Fatima, who's quite a character, when she was getting better, she had an nasogastric tube down, she'd walk around, and when she saw the guard, she'd say, I don't know how your conscience allows you to torture children like me. Really give it to the guards, she did. She's going to be a cracker, I can tell you. Okay, so those were the children in hospital. We had very sick children, we had very sick parents, and the parents had their own mental health issues. We had split families, we had to cope with the guards, and we had some run-ins with the guards. Subsequently, once they were well enough to go out of hospital, they were put into what's called APODs, alternative places of detention. I don't know if any of you have had anything to do with the alternative places of detention. I thought that would be okay. Alana just said to me, that is not going to be all right. And of course it wasn't. What happened was they put them into a hotel room with guards outside the door. I could tell you 2 guards per person. At one stage we had a 6-month-old in, not with pervasive refusal syndrome, but with an infection, and both parents and the child, and they had 6 guards. I said, are you going to get 2 out of there in case the child makes a roll for freedom or something? What's going on here? Anyway, so in the APODs, that was an awful place. I'd have thought that would be okay because they were free, relatively speaking, but they weren't free. They were under guard. If they wanted to go for a walk, they had to get permission. And the walks were tended to be set on certain times of the day, but if the parents had an appointment to go for a health check somewhere, then the walk was cancelled for the day and they wouldn't get out at all. Can you imagine you've got a 3 and a 4-year-old going absolutely stir crazy in these places? All that they were allowed to do was watch television. They weren't allowed writing equipment or, books and things like that. It was crazy. And they didn't get any education. They often would go into the rooms during the night and do security checks. Honestly. Deliberately, I think, to disturb the families. And we had no way of preventing all of these things happening. So look, 2018 was a nightmare year. But it's better this year. We're working with these children now. People like you are helping these children get into the community. When I saw the children, one of the children in the APOD was just in such a terrible state. A couple of weeks later, I saw him, a huge smile on his face. He was at school. He absolutely loves school. And so these kids, in the long run, they've got remarkable resilience. I think if the parents are doing okay, and the parents need a lot of help, then the children will be all right. But look, let's pride ourselves on the fact that we've got the children off the Nauru, we've got the public on our side. 80% of people in the public, when asked, said it was time to get all the children off Nauru. That's from 60% being against. Now we've got 80% for. Let's get the adults off Manus and Nauru as well. And let's be positive about it and be pleased with what we have achieved. Thank you.